work with Mitchell here. So Mitchell, he was just reminding me today that he arrived at Stanford in 2012, so 15 years prior to that, or something that he had been at New York University and has been studying kind of the edifice of higher education. He's an organizational sociologist, so how does higher education emerge in its present form from World War II and its relationship with governments and relationship with industry. And then he shows up at Stanford right as sort of the MOOC moment is taking off there. And Mitchell and I got to connect around that because I was at Harvard X at the same time. And we were trying to keep really good lines of collaboration open between Harvard and MIT and Stanford. And I think Mitchell was also one of the people who were saying, wow, this is a really exciting research opportunity that happens here in a bunch of different dimensions. Both the research opportunity to look really closely at how people do teaching and learning in online spaces, but also how new forms of online learning allow us to explore sort of, new versions of what higher education could be, or what education and credentialing and learning could be. Listening to Mitchell is always a good opportunity to say, oh yeah, like things that are that way, that are this way now don't have to be that way in the future. They probably weren't that way for very long, even though it seems like the things that we receive feel fixed to us. So this is a project that I'm really excited about. One of the things that happens periodically is that if you're doing research in online learning, you talk to the folks at Stanford and they're like, oh yeah, we've already been doing that for a while. So we had a project that we did where we took some Harvard X and MIT X learners and we interviewed them about their experiences. Mitchell's in the midst of a similar research project to try to gather more qualitative data to explore what kinds of things people are doing with MOOCs that we might not be expecting or anticipating. And so I'm thrilled that he's here to share some of that work with us here. So thank you, Mitchell.
Thank you, Justin, Molly. I really appreciate being here. I love thinking with MIT. I've thought with MIT for as an organization for quite a long time. And the MOOC phenomenon, it was sufficiently turbulent that it got sociologists, computer scientists, and learning scientists talking together at the same conferences. Sometimes at conferences, hi, come on in. Sometimes at conferences that didn't even exist before massively open online courses happened. I want to make clear a couple of things. One is I have no normative stakes in massively open online courses. I'm ambivalent about their relative value and virtue. I do have a strong normative investment in understanding and helping to narrate the ongoing evolution of the credential space in adult education in the United States at present. We live in an ecosystem in which the four-year baccalaureate degree is regarded as kind of sine qua non of respectability on several dimensions. It organizes the credential marketplace. But there's no reason to expect that the four-year degree will continue to have the hegemony that it currently enjoys. Indeed, that hegemony is not a time-invariant phenomenon by any stretch. The United States invented that marker during the Cold War and tied it to all sorts of high-status identities in the wake of World War II. And your institution and mine is largely organized around that credential, but there is a great deal of turbulence in the sector, and there's on my view, no question that lifelong instructional provision in English and Chinese, Spanish, French, and a few other languages is only going to continue. The large open question is how that sector is going to be organized and governed and in fact cognized. I found sort of massively open online courses to be good to think with also, both in terms of how colleges and universities like yours and mine imagine what they're doing in 2018, and also how American adults imagine what they're doing when they're accruing educational experiences. So I have two motivations for this. One is California is a very interesting place to live at this moment in history. It has the advantage, as a colleague of mine in government says, of being a functional democracy, which is nothing to be taken for granted at this moment. But the outgoing governor, the state is rich at present, and the outgoing governor has invested a good bit of money in scaffolding alternative educational pathways. Earlier this fall, he committed $120 additional million to create a fully online entity under the umbrella of the California Community College system, which is specifically purposed with providing educational credentials that are not necessarily stacking to AA and BA degrees. He's also invested tens of millions of dollars in conventional online education offerings in California community colleges. The education technology sector is, of course, very robust, with record amounts of venture capital moving into that space. And so there's a lot of resources and, shall we say, creative uncertainty. One of the endeavors I'm up to with several people at Stanford is a project called the Futures of Learning, Opportunity, and Work. Flow, my co-director is Mike Kirst, who's Jerry Brown's chief education advisor and a faculty member at Stanford, and also John Mitchell, who was the first vice provost for teaching and learning at Stanford, and will be the next chair of the Department of Computer Science. And essentially what we're trying to do with this project is signal to as many audiences in the state of California as possible that the capacity of the university is available to encourage the development of the evolution of a post-secondary ecosystem. Stanford is somewhat peculiar in its origin in that in the relatively recent decades that it became a great university, very recent decades, it didn't really have to think of itself as a servant of the state of California, because during the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the state of California was busy building the largest, most accessible, and most productive public higher education system theretofore in US history. So we were kind of off the hook in terms of sort of serving the state of California as a human capital incubator. And so we really thought of ourselves as servants of Washington and industry. Well, by no means can the human capital landscape of the state of California's going forward be taken for granted in terms of its quality and capacity. And it's been quite interesting as a sociologist to sort of watch Stanford sort of think through the extent to which it might imagine its responsibilities and opportunities to the human capital system of the state. I was also heavily involved in the MOOC phenomenon at Stanford, along with John Mitchell, sort of watched that and participated in it to some strong extent. But as a piece of evidence that suggests this kind of myopia that Stanford has to the state of California, or peculiar myopia, is that during the years that we were busy documenting massively open online courses as a kind of new gift that we'd given to the world, we'd never broken down our MOOC learner data at the state level. We'd never aggregated it. So we bragged about numbers of learners nationally and worldwide, but it hadn't even occurred to us to aggregate at the level of the state. And as I became, in more recent years, essentially lobbying for the gubernatorial efforts that I told you about earlier on behalf, came to sort of see that Stanford, while we'd done a lot of service on the K-12 side, we hadn't really sort of thought about California's adult learners as sort of part of our service constituency. And it occurred to me that the 6 years of MOOC offerings that we delivered might also be framed as a contribution to the human capital ecosystem in the state, and might enable us to talk with state leaders and philanthropies in ways that we hadn't before. So this summer we began sort of to describe Stanford's California MOOC learners at the state level. There is a significant sort of quantitative descriptive part of this study. I'm not going to show you a single statistic in this presentation, not because I'm anti-number, but because the numbers are still fuzzy, essentially. We haven't cleaned the data adequately for me to be able to responsibly describe, to put actual numbers on the screen. So I'm not going to do that. Our team is busy doing it. But suffice it to say that since 2012, on two platforms, the Coursera platform and the Lagunita platform, the latter is an edX-based bespoke platform that Stanford developed to convey its courses. On both Stanford's Coursera and Lagunita platforms, our course offerings have seen about 440,000 Californians, by which about 440,000 Californians have clicked register, right? Now, of course, the number of more dedicated users goes way down, so very quickly. I should say 440,000 Californians have taken either at least one Stanford Coursera or Lagunita MOOC. About half of those have taken a Lagunita MOOC, so about 220,000 have taken a Lagunita MOOC. And the qualitative work that I'm going to be presenting today is sampled just from Stanford's Lagunita learners because we just have more control and jurisdiction over those data. It was easier to sample them. So of those 220,000 Lagunita learners, about 12,000 of them had consumed more than 20% of the videos that we offered. And about 7,000 of them had observed more than 50% of the videos. And what my team and I decided to do was just concentrate on those 7,000 learners who had invested some non-trivial amount of time and effort in a free Lagunita course, and try to get some handle in an agnostic and open-ended way about what they imagined they were doing when they were spending some number of hours taking a MOOC course. Not surprisingly, as is often the case, it's true worldwide. The great preponderance of people who are serious users of MOOCs are well-educated, urban professionals with stable incomes. They're heavily concentrated in the Bay Area, LA and San Diego counties. They are where you would think they would be. They are earning the amount of money you think they would be earning. And they do the kinds of jobs that you think they would do based on the careful work that's been done with MIT and Harvard MOOC learners. Okay, it's an urban phenomenon, no question. And this sort of this heaviness in the San Francisco Bay Area, I think, is very much part of the origin story of at least I would say post 2012 forward MOOC learners. So motivation number one is let's see how we might think about MOOCs relative to the California human capital system. The motivation two that I want to spend my time on today is what is a MOOC? In a science studies sense, a MOOC is a classic boundary object. It is neither fish nor fowl, right? There is no clear shared understanding about what a massively open online course is. And because of that uncertainty, there's a lot of controversy that surrounds what a MOOC ought to be, appropriately is, whether and the extent to which it should be part of the resource portfolio of a great university, right? There's a lot of discussion about these things. The first line that emerged about MOOCs, and again, there's not going to be any citations either, because I never read other people's scholarship. No, because I want to just focus on the party line. And I'm going to be sure and leave plenty of time for discussion, but please raise your hand whenever you like. Many argued, especially in the early 2012 to 15, that MOOCs are just bad college courses, essentially, that they're poor substitutes. They're kind of a lie that Silicon Valley created to tell positive stories about some new product development that was underway. And there's no question that MOOCs were very much a part of the Silicon Valley hype machine. I dare say that's part of how we got edX, but that's another story for another day. But there is a sort of standing notion that what are MOOCs? Well, they're bad college courses, or they're poor substitutes for college courses. But of course, college course is only one way of conceptualizing a massively open online course. When George Siemens at Athabasca University started to promulgate the form, he did not have in mind that a MOOC would be a college course conveyed online. And when Daphne Kohler and Andrew Ng initially tied certificates to their courses in the computer science department at Stanford, I dare say they didn't imagine that what they were offering was a poor substitute for a course. It was we might call something new under the sun. It's something that had never existed before. It was, and by new under the sun I mean it was offered by some of the world's most elite universities and top specialists for free, and everyone could access them, right? And that combination of assets had never been tied together before, and it captured the imagination of a great many powerful people, among them John Hennessy, the president of Stanford in 2012, and many members of Stanford's Board of Trustees. It was that novelty that created so much of the turbulence and uncertainty, I would suggest. What I find is interesting, up until the present, in fact, is that not even the providers of MOOCs know what they are, right? We debate constantly about, where MOOCs should fit into our overall instructional portfolios. And I must take my hat off to my many colleagues at MIT, because you guys have really, on my view, thought the most about this, and have done the most sort of cultural and organizational innovation about this. But my colleague at Stanford, Harvard, Michigan, Princeton, Yale, there are quite a few of the nation's sort of most elite and esteemed universities who are investing resources in these offerings, and we still don't know what they are, right? Our MOOC takers, are they students? Justin and I and others were involved. We helped to accrete the notion that, in fact, MOOC learners were not students, they were learners. I'm delighted that learner has come to accrete, has become the sort of the term of the scientific community. I don't take responsibility for that, but I think it's a much more appropriate term than student. Should MOOC learners get alumni magazines? What unit should they fall under, right? Should we have a MOOC department? Should they be governed by the Senate faculty? Should people be able to count MOOCs against their teaching loads, right? These questions are all open, at least in Palo Alto. Does FERPA apply to them? It took a couple of years to get that figured out. And what constitutes success or failure in these things? And so again, I would suggest that there's a good bit of uncertainty, even among those who build these things, about what it is that they are. And so the way in which we decided to move forward was to be agnostic about that question, and to ask people who had invested non-trivially in terms of their time and attention in Stanford's Lagunitas offerings, what it is that they're doing. And we created an interview protocol, which I'm happy to share. It's essentially a user experience approach, the basic idea being that we produce pieces of culture, and then consumers of culture do things with those objects that we can't ever anticipate, right? So the classic example is Janet Radway's 1982 Reading the Romance, a famous literary theorist who spent time with women who read what critics often call the trashy magazines that you used to buy at cash registers in grocery stores, right? Like, why do well-educated women who could spend their time in any number of ways, read 600-page steamy page turners that they pick up at the Safeway? And the argument that Radway very famously made was that women are making use of this literary genre to have experiences that the actual men in their lives aren't able to give them, right? So they're a way of fairly safely engaging in a sort of parallel world of experience that enables them to have versions of experiences that their current life and circumstance won't enable them. A similar long tradition of research has to do with what it is that students do with college, regardless of what the grown-ups think they should be doing, right? The phenomenological divide between me and the undergraduates in my classroom is quite profound, and as any faculty member well understands, there's a substantial divide between what I think Stanford students should be doing with their time and energy and what they're actually doing with their time and energy, right? And to sort of fully understand an educational experience, I have to sort of radically bracket what as an educator I think should be going on, and take the perspective of the consumer to see what he or she is doing with that cultural object. And so that's essentially the very straightforward, kind of classic, generic ethnographer's trick that we pulled in this project. And what we decided to do was systematically sample as systematically as we could from those 7,000 highly invested learners, right? In fact, we cut it down to about 4,000 highly invested learning, meaning those who had, we instrumented on those who had viewed more than 50% of the videos available in a Lagunitas course. So we, very substantially shrunk the population, and then we tried to get as much of as many non-urban users as we could, and we tried to get some reasonable distribution by gender, and I won't go into large detail here, but again, in keeping with what you would expect of this demographic, about 2/3 of the respondents were male, and about 1/3 of them were female. In general, they were fairly highly educated, but we did what we could to get an idea, especially a spatial spread. And we have a sample size of 60. We just completed the interviews over the course of the summer and transcribed them, and what are the main takeaways that we're seeing right now? And I will be sure and leave time for discussion. I want to make two general points. One is, and some of this is going to seem kind of obvious, but I think there were some things that really caught me off guard in a positive way. So hopefully there's some nuggets here that are useful. And I'm eager for your feedback. Respondents use MOOCs for acquiring, enhancing skills. They use them for self-care and self-improvement. The most surprising thing for me is that they seem also to be using MOOCs to enable or facilitate life transitions. And then, this may seem like a truism as well, that the value of MOOCs as credentials is ambiguous, but I think this sends us as MOOC providers a strong signal and encouragement to scaffold these offerings perhaps more thoughtfully than we currently do. Okay, so these are some quotes that we pulled from the interviews. We had a great time with these. They were digitally mediated. I had a lovely team. We let people identify themselves, and they usually did. I might call on someone in the room to read these just for fun. Okay, so this is Bella, 39, a PhD student from the Sacramento area. Would you read, Bella?
English is not my first language, and so this I took a course in science writing in 2013, right after I moved to the U.S. And at the time, I felt like half of the time I don't even understand clearly what people are saying in the way just like British English and American English. Of course, they're English, but they're also different. I remember that this course really helped me start changing the way I wrote, and also gave me some ideas of where I'd look for more information.
This is one of the most heavily subscribed Lagunitas courses we have. Is in science writing. You get this a lot. So you hear someone, she's getting her PhD. She knows how to speak English, but she's getting a little extra value out of this particular course. I love this one. Molly, would you read that one?
Sure. I legitimately think anybody who works in business or consulting and uses Excel, SQL, right? Like in this day and age where we deal with the mountains of data that we do, I think they really needed to make this more foundational in terms of teaching this in college.
Great. I have some skills. I'm learning some more skills. Read this one too, will you? This is Molly. Yeah.
The course brought me up to speed on advances in the database management system world, Now I know that NoSQL doesn't mean that there is no SQL. It means not only SQL. And I understand a new way of getting mass quantities of data into binary trees. I never used that term, but I understand it. So I learned a whole bunch of what exactly I wanted to learn. It did exactly for me what I was hoping. It brought me up to speed.
In some ways in the category of Google searches and when people went to libraries, right? Enhancement opportunities, right? Self-care is one that came up often. Self-improvement, certainly a lot of especially retired people would mention they were using these for entertainment. But there are sort of some striking idiosyncratic ways in which some people use these opportunities. Sir, right in the middle, could you read this?
I think I can. Let me get my glasses.
Oh, sure. That's even better.
Didn't know they'd be a test. I was working a lot of hours at that time at a pretty high stress, high pressure job. And I was very explicitly trying to do this thing for myself, to keep myself sane. And so, I mean, I see why you're asking me to read this. And so one of those things I did was to take this course on a topic that I cared about. And so I was probably working, I don't know, 60 to 80 hours around that time. And then that's why some weeks I didn't have time to come home and do the course after work. I would do it on the weekends, but I made it a point that even if I was getting home later, like, I'd be home at 8 p.m., I would turn on the course lecture and I would eat my dinner and listen to it, and it was a way for me to just almost like de-stress from my normal day while also learning something useful.
Thanks very much. So, clearly someone who's fully employed, and also, who took our $25 to talk on the phone about these, suggests that, she's getting some value out of them, right? And then there's this category that again, I kind of found the most striking. Justin, I'll ask you to read this one.
I work full-time and I have children, so if I was going to be doing any sort of master's coursework, it would be online. So being able to have that sort of like practice experience of doing this type of education online, like if I can be successful at it here, it's highly likely that I'll be successful at it in the degree program.
I might start paying tuition to Arizona State University, but before I pay tuition to Arizona State University, I'll try out a couple of courses and see if it'll work for someone like me, right? Life transition, gentleman in the middle there, yes?
Yep. The information I learned in it is going to be with me the rest of my life, and I may be in that situation where somebody else may be giving me care, and I may need to think about how to frame my mind on how to get through the difficult situations in my life.
Wife is dying, I want to be a good caregiver, here's an opportunity for me to learn how to be a better caregiver, I'm not going to forget that lesson, right? There were others that I could have quoted as well. There was one who talked about the death of her husband, and she was taking the opportunity to think about how she would spend the additional kind of cognitive space of her life, and so she took a bunch, she consumed a bunch of MOOCs just to kind of think about what next steps might be for her. Okay, so those preliminary findings, people are making use of these things in ways that Stanford certainly does not describe on its website when we're talking about these. Okay, but then it's also became quite clear to us, and we want to still see how much pattern variation there is in the data, that there's a great variety of there's ambiguity among users about the value of MOOCs as credentials. So here's someone who says, I wasn't a good student in college, and I was so proud taking a course from Stanford, and until the last moment, I'm hoping I'm going to pass it, and I'm going to make a good grade, that kind of thing. And when I passed it, and I got the certificate, I still have the certificate, I'm proud of it, It was mainly because it was a Stanford course that I really enjoyed it. We don't know what Simon does. He told us that he works at home. That could mean any number of things, right? And here's another person who seems to be investing a credential-like value, and he has to, could you read this, please? Yeah.
I have the paper to back it up. You know what I mean? I have the little certificate thing. It's in black and white. It doesn't matter. I think that's also important to mention, that if someone gets something, they can print at the end of it to show that they actually took it, and didn't just say they took it. We know that fraud exists. People pretend they have degrees, and then they get away with it until they don't. You know what I mean? So being able to prove that, and that's why I didn't put the medical education.
Of course, that she didn't mention to us in our survey, because she didn't.
Because it didn't pass. I didn't really complete it.
So she told us about a course that she got a certificate in, but she didn't tell us about a course that she didn't get a certificate in, right? So clearly, meaningfully investing in completion, right? Whereas Denise, the person who watched these after work in San Mateo, says, the woman to your right, yes? Yes, please.
It doesn't matter if a person completes it, right? If I'm a professional, why would I care about a certificate or a degree? It doesn't give me anything. I'm doing it purely for learning purposes.
And then, on my view, sort of the the quintessence of ambiguity is a product manager in fintech in San Francisco. He says, this doesn't really appeal to me too much, but I know this will help others. Friends are enrolled in a few courses, like this having some sort of like certification. I know it sounds kind of cheesy. I don't really need a certification to tell me that I've taken or completed a course, but it does help others, so they can put something on their resume or have some sort of like hard, proof that they've taken the class. For me, I could care less. All I have is an email confirmation telling me that my class starts tomorrow or whatever. It's fine.
So are these dictated or are people actually writing in this?
Oh no, these are transcribed.
These are transcriptions of verbal
These are
comments.
transcriptions of, and there's quite a few ums and kindas and you knows
It's the
that have
likes
been
and hearts.
removed.
People don't write that way, so.
Right. Yeah, right.
Fine.
Okay. So there's and one of the things that we want to look at more systematically, both with the data that we have in hand, but also more generally, is it may well be the case that that there's an inverse relationship to people's academic experiences and the relative investment they put in these certifications, right? So, in which case, in other words, people with who are sort of less sophisticated consumers may be over presuming the value of what they're getting, but we have yet to sort of look at that systematically. But that leads. But I want to sort of keep throw that out as a possibility when I get to the takeaways, and then we're done. One is that calling MOOCs suboptimal college courses, on my view, misses the point. Well, what's the point, Stevens? The meaning and utilities of MOOCs are varied, and they're evolving as we go along, right? People are making use of these opportunities in ways that we can only partly intuit independently of them. On my view, users may be cannier in their utilization of MOOCs than MOOC providers are in representing them, right? That, again, sort of classic UX, right? Listen to your customers and sort of think about what your product is, and then re-narrate that product, as you go along, and who knows, evolve the product itself in light of how users are using it. And then finally, I think this may have sort of a more proximate kind of policy implication, is that the value of MOOCs as credentials is ambiguous. I think for places like Stanford and MIT, this has both opportunities and risks. The opportunity is that we can, create new versions of ourselves that crystallize around new particular meanings. So, MIT offerings with some sort of documentation, might have a wide plurality of values, and that might perfectly fit with the mission of our institution. The risk is that people may be doing things with our offerings that we would prefer that they not do, or that it may even be irresponsible of us to allow them to do, right? And so one of the things that I'm going to take back to the leadership at Stanford is we may have a responsibility to more explicitly scaffold for our users what it is that they can expect from Stanford MOOC offerings, and make clearer what we think they are and appropriately are not. Clearly, people are trusting the institution I work for. They're seeing it as a brand of value. And again, that's an opportunity, but it may involve some responsibilities to our new user communities that we have yet to fully recognize. I'll stop there. I'm listening. Yes.
Could you say more about that? Like, what are you talking about specifically that last point? Like,
Oh.
what kinds of things are you worried?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I'm worried about. Because there's so much ambiguity of credential value at present, and because so many parties, well, how crass do I want to be? The markets for credentials are organized almost fundamentally around information asymmetries, right? I mean, a lot of the value that comes from a Stanford degree is predicated on the notion that the value itself is very difficult to precisely measure, right? We might call that mystique, essentially. And we all know that those, the economists have explained to us very, very well that those information asymmetries bring a lot of risk to consumers. And functioning markets create governance mechanisms that do the trusting for the consumer. This is the Wild West. We don't have those governance mechanisms that do that trusting for us, and so I worry that that the responsibility of a high-end player just to sort of set norms for clarity of what they're offering may oblige us to to be a little more explicit about what we think MOOCs are appropriately for and not for. Does that help?
Yes, it does. So your concerns are around the credential specifically, as opposed to, say, how the content is used or the information.
Yeah, my concern is twofold. One is around the reputation of the provider, right? So I think the upside here is that we might be able to, we probably can tell many more happy stories about the positive value that we offer than we currently do, because we don't explicitly recognize these these off-label uses, as we say, right? So we could do that, but we may also be creating false expectations that will disappoint our users down the line in ways that could have deleterious effects. And boy, are there a lot of people out there, exploiting that information asymmetry in ways that MIT and Stanford would prefer not to have happen. So, yes, sir.
This may be a somewhat naive question, but I remember when MIT launched OpenCourseWare in 2002.
2002, yes.
What we found was pretty much what I'm hearing here. So I'm trying to understand nothing seems to have changed in these 16 years.
What sounds the same?
Calling MIT OpenCourseWare college courses misses the point. Meeting and utility with MIT OpenCourseWare really didn't involve
Okay.
users are cannier, they're doing all kinds of things, you get to clear exams or
Okay.
So I'm just trying to get a sense of qualitatively is there a difference between something like OpenCourseWare and MOOC 16 years later?
I love that I asked you to rephrase that question because it gave me 30 seconds to think a little bit more. Okay. I would say
I've often done that.
you knew that trick, right? Here's what I say: the world around MIT and Stanford has changed substantially since 2002. For one, we have the for-profit college debacle, right? So we had a whole category of new entrants into the market in the first decade of the 21st century that, on my view, stole money from the federal government by running it through the bank accounts of people who didn't know what they were purchasing and ruined lives of millions of people. That disaster was just under development in 2002. The second is that with OpenCourseWare, I don't recall MIT promising that it was going to, upend higher education as we knew it. I don't recall people saying that, at the end, soon there would be 10 universities standing and one of them would be Coursera. I mean, there was some pretty spectacular hyperbole, or was Udacity, sorry. Some pretty spectacular hyperbole that happened in MOOC mania, which I think sort of disrupted people's presumptions about what a degree was and was not. So that's what I was suggesting. There's the offerings are similar, and the uses to which people are putting them are similar, but the discourse around what a degree is has changed in that half generation. You're welcome to follow up if you like. Okay, yeah.
I'm interested in the story that you want to tell to California now with this, and to some extent also with your first slide, or your slides about geographic concentration. So you're saying, all right, so we go mine this data, we look in the aggregate California, and like, oh, it looks like we're mostly helping LA, San Diego, and San Francisco primarily.
Right.
And then does California just come back? Like, how do you say like, hey, California, this is awesome, look at these people are helping, or do you say like, oh shoot, like those are the people that California already helps.
Right.
The people who are already really thriving.
Yeah.
Like I will say, here's something,
Yeah.
you know Andrew.
Andrew Ng.
Andrew Ho.
Andrew Ho, yes.
Who was, Larry Bacow, the new president of Harvard, I'm sure you know, and the others, has said that one of the reasons that he took that job, was to try to convince the nation, I think particularly policymakers in the US, that, higher education has some real value to the national enterprise and shouldn't be, taken away. So to me, there's a parallel to this effort here, like, hey, Governor Brown of California, like we have value to offer. And I'm just curious, like, based on everything that you just said, what are the next sort of sentences in your story?
Yeah, that's really good. And I heard about, President Bacow and Dean Terry Long visit Pontiac, Michigan recently.
Yep, right.
And I'm very glad that the president of Harvard is making those efforts, and boy should he, and boy should every president and chancellor of a well-endowed, tax-exempt, officially private university be. But this does not make for a good policy brief, right? Which hasn't been written. A couple of thoughts, I would say. Did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, well, just a question on this. How much does this distribution differ than the population density distribution?
Yes, good, thank you. Yeah, pretty close though. I mean, this is the bulk of the population is here, but nevertheless, I mean, we have, I think there were like two users in, not in Fresno, it's a little larger, but 2 users in Stockton, California, or something like that. Here's what I would say. I would say it doesn't surprise me at all that Stanford's MOOC learners look like this, because who are Stanford's faculty? And what kinds of courses do they teach, right? Like if you're Andrew Ng and you're gonna offer a machine learning course, right? You're basically presuming a certain kind of user, right? We have only begun to think about how this form could evolve for other users, right? Although one individual faculty has, so my colleague Joe Bowler, who's a math educator, has developed a whole portfolio of courses called How to Learn Math. And boy, does that sell like hotcakes to young people and their parents and teachers. But she's using the form and evolving it toward a particular kind of user. So in my view, this is really an artifact of who the early providers of 2012 MOOCs were. And if we thought about serving a wider plurality of Californians, but that is work that remains to be done.
Yeah, sort of a follow-up on that specific point. One of the users of OpenEdX has put up a course site in Malaysia specifically on vocational training. And they have all these courses on how to be a better pig farmer, how to be a good barber, how to do manicures well. And it's a very different target audience than the original MOOC providers.
Amen. Did you have a hand, sir?
Yeah, so I think that was right. So as you see the sort of this distribution and you look at the groups that are maybe not being served well, is there a way to inform what the next steps in the evolution of the sort of MOOC offering should be or might look like based off of what you're not seeing in this?
Yeah, and this is where I deeply believe it's really a question of institutional will and ambition. So there's no question that a lot of the most interesting things that are happening in this turbulent sector are not happening at Stanford and Harvard and MIT. You're doing a lot of cool stuff. I love coming to MIT because you're doing such cool stuff. But it's the Southern New Hampshire universities and Arizona State universities and Purdue Kaplans of the world that are really, are really sort of organized, fundamentally rethinking how conventional post-secondary provision happens. I think it's little doubt that there's been so much anxiety at the Harvards and Stanfords of the world around these things because we don't know what we want them to be, right? And we're not sure if they're brand dilution or brand extension. We certainly don't want, MOOCs in a sense were as much a black eye for the elites as they were anything else because of the rapid imposition of this definition that they were failed college courses, right? I think that's what froze a lot of the activity at places like my own. But I could imagine a president or chancellor of a university developing a story about MOOCs or MOOC-like offerings that does not compare them does not make direct comparisons to credit-bearing courses, right? We could draw, for example, on the long tradition of agricultural extensions that defined much of higher education funding through the second half of the 19th century, through the New Deal. I mean, there are ways in which we could talk about providing, versions of ourselves to larger constituencies. But that, on my view, is sort of an institution-level decision about, what role is the 35-year-old consultant watching Stanford TV after work gonna play in the story that I tell about my university? And that's the sort of narrative opportunity, in my view. Yes?
Is there a reason you chose video watching as your credential for selection versus problems? And if you chose problems instead, do you think that would change your interview data?
Probably, and we should, shouldn't we?
Because I mean, at MIT, we're happy if people are watching the videos, but we care way more if they do the problems.
Mhm.
Because we think that's more important for the learning experience.
Yeah.
Like, we do view it more, at least in sciences, like, if you watch the videos, at least you're doing it like you're watching YouTube or watching
Mhm.
TV and for fun. But they're really, people I feel that are more committed to learning are the ones doing the problems.
Should I be standing on the other side of the room for the
okay.
for the map? Okay. Yeah, that's good on several dimensions. One is we picked something that and fairly randomly, and it seemed easy to instrument. So, and my computer science colleague said it worked. It was a good idea for him, so we did it. But that's sort of two takeaways. One is there's little question that we should develop new measures of involvement or engagement, right? The whole idea that you have to complete these things to get value from them is inadequate, right? So coming up with some, multiple measures of use, utilization, engagement, learning, who knows, maybe people even learn something. I don't think people have to learn something in any measurable way to get value from them, which is another thing that I hope we can keep in mind. That people can get value from these offerings without, quote, learning, unquote, in a learning science kind of way. But also, Laura Perna at Penn suggested this to me. We should develop new kinds of utility measures at different time points as well, right? So, one of the things that's very useful in returns to college education metrics is, on my view, to ask people retrospectively, fairly at some distance from the experience, what they gained from their time at school X. And it seems to me very reasonable that we could come up with, measures of utility that sample people at, further out from their experiences. I will say one more thing, which is you're helping me to understand, is that I worry that this kind of learning stuff that we have in our head is gonna, as analysts and providers, is gonna constrain us into presuming to know, what value people are getting from these offerings, because it may be that a lot of the value that they're getting is not gonna be measured in a learning metric kind of way. Yes?
So I'm wondering if there's a value to thinking about how people watch YouTube.
Yes, yes.
Which is not at all credential. Certainly has the de-stressing, those other aspects that you talk about.
Yes, that's good. And, boy, oh boy, I mean, there's a lot of industry investigation in how people are deriving value from let's say, things that we might put in the category of massively open online courses. And again, I think this may be one of the things I will definitely take away from our discussion is, if we limit it to learning, we might let others, do the value measuring on our behalf, right? So I think that's a great question. Like, how do people assemble different kinds of let's say learning opportunities or instructional opportunities, right? How are they fitting what we are offering into some larger portfolio of opportunities? there's no question that organizations with much larger resources and many more data traces of users than MIT and Stanford are going to develop that science. And so maybe we should think quite broadly about the range of values that we might be offering and the way in which our offerings are sort of fitting into the overused word sort of ecosystem of instructional provision. Yes? And then you, sir. No, go. No.
Building on your point of the, faculty course creator mindset and what their assumptions about a user population or learner population might be, I just wanted to add that broadly speaking, those same people built these platforms.
Yes, that's for sure.
So
Right.
those assumptions are baked in terms of what the tools can do.
That works with our YouTube comment as well, right? That how flexible do we want to be thinking about genre? That's a really good MIT question, right? That's a really good MIT question. Go ahead.
So most of the MOOCs I've seen, they tend to follow that education banking model. And I was curious if you've seen any interesting innovations in that space and kind of getting away from that banking model into something a little more, I don't know.
Explain. Be sure that the room knows what you mean by the banking model. I know what you mean.
I guess when you go point by point, seeing the student as an empty bank account in which little deposits of knowledge need to be made, as opposed to trying to stimulate cognition and I guess more problem solving and I guess not making as such a strict hierarchy between the teacher and the student, but rather the teacher acting as a catalyst for cognition within the students. Yeah.
Well, you know this. You know your colleague here, Justin Reich. You know this gentleman?
I'm a student.
That's great. That's great. Well, because there's a couple of labs at MIT under open learning that are actively engaged in that sort of stuff. So you're in the right place. Find this guy. On my view, the big question here is measurement. So we live in a world in which there is nothing exists without measurement. And essentially what I'm suggesting is that we need to find measures that capture utilities that would reflect how people are actually using this stuff. So I think I gave you at least some thumbnail evidence that this is not that people are not banking here. Maybe they are. They're learning. They're learning what NoSQL means, right? So they're getting stuff like that. But they're also extracting value from these experiences that don't sort of fit into that banking model. In my view, the challenge for us as providers and as scientists is to try and first articulate those values and then try to come up with some sort of proxies for those values so that we can explain them to our president and provost, right? And we can say, actually, what we're providing is valuable to thousands of people. It looks and feels like this, right? And so, to me, that's kind of simultaneously a scientific and a phenomenological challenge. Like, how do we articulate something that we can measure? Yeah. Yes, sir.
And just getting into the value, there's some segment of people that are doing this to further their careers and trying to, this is kind of an academic perspective, but looking at it if people did it to advance their careers or something like that, asking them if it worked, if they got what they wanted out of it, or talking to people who are making hiring decisions about what is the value of it.
Yes, absolutely. And that's where, there's no question, because there's another user here, basically, which is the employer, right? And boy, is there a lot of faith in the philanthropic, well, there's a lot, whatever the philanthropic world is these days, but there's a lot of philanthropy chasing something called competency, right? On the notion that competency is going to be used by employers to give people opportunities, right? So it's sort of like presumption inside of presumption inside of presumption. There's a whole other set of users, and those are employers, And we need to be talking to employers as, we need to ask these same questions of hiring offices. You know, what are these things as far as you're concerned? What would you want these things to be? What would they have to be in order for you to treat them like some other thing that you now sort of officially or systematically value? So I think, you know, one is, let's do this kind of research with employers. I think also this could create conditions on for a you know, another sort of, I think MIT, I see the time, I'm delighted for the exchange. I don't have to go anywhere if you want to stay, talk to me, but I do think we need to be thinking in a sort of systems way rather than in a certificate or program way, because there's only so much that MIT as MIT can do, however good its offerings are, without sort of thinking about the recipient of those gifts. And so I think, you know, a promising thing to do is to engage those potential recipients in helping us think through what our new offerings might be.
And why is like Stanford, MIT in charge of making the MOOCs? Like whenever you hear about skills gaps, why aren't these employers just making their own?
Well, in fact, they are.
Okay, I wasn't.
Yeah, in fact, they are, and I can give you some. And then there are these very large critters like LinkedIn. No, sorry, Microsoft. No, LinkedIn/Microsoft, right? That are now in the business of purveying instructional opportunities themselves. So, you know, we are only a few players in a very rapidly expanding population of instructional opportunity providers, shall we say.
Let's end the formal part
Yes.
of the talk now, but then it's great that
Yeah.
you're here to talk
Happy to stay.
casually with people. That would be awesome.
Sure.
Thank
Thanks.
you so much.
Thanks very much.